On Sunday, the 19th of December, 1154, the greatest nobles, religious figures, and politicians of the day gathered at Westminster Abbey. Not long afterwards, 21-year-old King Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, walked through the abbey, where Henry was then crowned by Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. His coronation marked the formal beginning of the House of Plantagenet as the ruling dynasty after a long civil war known as the Anarchy. How did this young man, who was born in Le Mans in France, end up founding a new dynasty, and how did the members of it shape the history of England? This is the story of the House of Plantagenet. The rise of the Plantagenets to become the ruling dynasty of England was a byproduct of how interrelated England and France's politics had become during the High Middle Ages. Through the early medieval period, England had been ruled by a group of roughly 7 Germanic Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, though the number fluctuated over time. The Danes or Norse invaders arrived from the late 8th century onwards, and over time, an Anglo-Norse culture and society developed along with a unified Kingdom of England in the 10th century. Throughout a significant proportion of this period, England's contact with France was surprisingly limited. It was only in the 10th century that English kings began regularly forming dynastic alliances through marriage with the French royal family or senior aristocrats there. By the 11th century, this was commonplace. And so, when King Edward the Confessor died without a male heir in 1066, one of the claimants to the throne of England was Duke William of Normandy in northern France. As is well known, he crossed to England, defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, and completed the Norman conquest. England became a country with a ruling Norman-French elite and a Norman royal dynasty, the House of Normandy. This also meant that, in addition to being kings of England, William the Conqueror and his successors controlled Normandy in northern France. Moreover, their territorial possessions on the continent expanded in the 12th century to include places like Anjou and Aquitaine, as well as Normandy, Maine, and the Vexin, an expansion that was fundamentally connected to the rise of the House of Plantagenet and which would also shape the dynasty's long history down to the 14th century. William the Conqueror died in 1087 and was laid to rest at Caen in northern France, again emphasizing the family's fundamental connection to France and how they viewed themselves as French rather than English. He was succeeded by his son, William Rufus, who lived down to 1100. He was killed in a hunting accident, which might not have actually been accidental at all. His brother Henry then seized the throne and became King Henry I of England. It was during his long reign down to 1135 that the events which brought the House of Plantagenet to power began. The House of Plantagenet is a French family. Its roots lie in the county of Anjou in north-central France, to the south of the Duchy of Normandy and east of the city of Nantes in Brittany. The father of King Henry II, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, was born here on the 24th of August 1113. His father was Fulk of Anjou, a French lord who had decided to head to the Holy Land in 1129 to help defend the Crusade estates that had been established there 20 years earlier. Fulk ended up marrying Melisande, the daughter of Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem. As a consequence, in 1131, he succeeded his father-in-law and became King Fulk of Jerusalem, ruling down to his death in 1143. As such, the English kings of the House of Plantagenet were descended from a family that once ruled over the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. More broadly, the family traced its lineage in north-central France back to the 10th century. Owing to his father's departure for the Holy Land, Geoffrey became the interim Count of Anjou when he was a teenager, and that title was made permanent when his father ascended as King of Jerusalem, as there was now no possibility that Fulk would return to France. Although Geoffrey is regularly referred to as Geoffrey Plantagenet in modern studies, in reality he went by the title of Geoffrey of Anjou in his own time, and the Plantagenet name was only applied retroactively from the 15th century onwards to the members of the dynasty. The name derives from the Latin planta genista, a description of the yellow flowers known as broom, which Geoffrey was said to regularly wear a sprig of. Henry II, the first English king of the House of Plantagenet, was the son of Geoffrey of Anjou, but he derived his claim to the throne of England from his mother. This was Matilda of the House of Normandy. She was the daughter of King Henry I, who had risen to rule England after the suspicious death of his brother in 1100. Henry I almost certainly fathered more illegitimate children than any monarch in English or British history, perhaps more than 24. However, he only had 2 children through his marriage to Matilda of Scotland, a daughter named Matilda and a son named William Adelin. William died on the 25th of November 1120 in the White Ship disaster, when the boat he was on sank after hitting a large rock after pulling out of the port of Barfleur. This meant that Matilda was now Henry I's only legitimate heir. English succession law did not prohibit women from succeeding to the throne, but in an age when the foremost duty of a monarch was to lead men into battle, it proved impossible for Henry to convince the nobles and other powerful figures within his realm to accept Matilda as his successor. In an attempt to remedy this situation, he organized for Matilda to marry Geoffrey of Anjou, a union which would secure the southern border of the Duchy of Normandy, and also convince the English and Norman nobles that Matilda would have a husband alongside her, who would rule partly as king. However, the English barons still refused to accept the dispensation, and when Henry I died in 1135, many of them offered their support to Stephen of Blois, a grandson of William the Conqueror on his mother's side. A civil war, the anarchy, commenced over Stephen and Matilda's competing claims to the throne. Contemporary accounts indicate it was a particularly destructive war of succession that dragged on across the 1140s and into the 1150s. In the end, it was resolved by a series of deaths. Geoffrey Plantagenet died on the 7th of September 1151. 2 years later, Stephen's heir, Eustace, died, and then Stephen himself passed away on the 25th of October 1154. This all paved the way for Matilda and Geoffrey's son to succeed Stephen as King Henry II. Henry's accession marked the start of the House of Plantagenet. It also ushered in the age of the Angevin Empire, so named because of Henry's forebears being the Counts of Anjou. The Angevin Empire is a term used to describe the sheer extent of the territory that Henry ruled over. When he became King of England, he didn't just secure control over England itself. The kings of England had not fully conquered Wales yet, but they had a lot of influence over the country. He also ruled over the Duchy of Normandy as a result of the succession, and the County of Anjou to the south. As well as this, in 1152, 2 years before they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey, Henry had married Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine. He had died without a male heir in 1137, and Eleanor had succeeded to one of the largest territories in France. Aquitaine covered a large part of western France. Thus, due to his marriage to Eleanor and his succession to the English-held territories in France, Henry ruled over a substantial block of northern and western France, rivaling the power of the French crown there, although, in theory, Henry owed homage to the French king as ruler of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. In addition to all of this, in 1169, a cohort of Anglo-Norman lords launched an expedition to Ireland and began the conquest of the island. After the initial stages of that conquest were complete, Henry crossed over in 1171 and was proclaimed as Lord of Ireland. As a result of these events, the House of Plantagenet not only assumed control over the crown of England in 1154, but 20 years later, Henry ruled over an Angevin Empire consisting of England, Wales, parts of Ireland, and most of northern and western France. As powerful as he was, Henry's rule was never stable. There were multiple issues inherent within it. Firstly, Henry engaged in a deepening struggle with the Church in the 1160s. This was not uncommon in Europe during the High Middle Ages, as multiple monarchs sought to acquire more effective secular control over the rich ecclesiastical properties in their realms, as well as control over the appointments of bishops and other church officials. In England's case, this manifested as a clash between Henry and a man he had been close to as a political ally, Thomas Becket, the former Lord Chancellor of England, and later the Archbishop of Canterbury. Years of acrimony between the two men came to an end on the 29th of December 1170, when Thomas was murdered by a group of assassins said to be acting on the king's behalf, though whether Henry ordered the killing has been debated since the 12th century. What was especially controversial about this act was that Becket, the senior churchman of England, was slain in Canterbury Cathedral, a sanctified place. Henry was threatened with excommunication following Becket's murder, though Rome never followed through fully on this. Though more generally, he had more than enough other issues to contend with. Although his marriage with Eleanor led to a large brood of children, the relationship between the king and queen descended into acrimony, and she began encouraging her sons to revolt against their father. 3 of them, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, went to war with their father in 1173, actions which resulted in Eleanor being placed in confinement for the rest of Henry's lifetime. The revolt was suppressed in 1174, but the rest of Henry's reign down to his death in 1189 was characterized by frequent clashes and rivalries within the family. Henry II died on the 6th of July 1189. His heir of many years, Henry the young king, had predeceased him in 1183. This meant that an even younger son, Richard the Lionheart, succeeded him as King Richard I. Richard is one of the most celebrated rulers of the House of Plantagenet. In some ways, this is peculiar. There is no doubt that he epitomized the high medieval military ruler who engaged in warfare, but his endeavors were of mixed success. When he became king in 1189, Richard had already taken the cross and was preparing to head to the Holy Land as one of the leaders of the Third Crusade, which was being organized in response to the capture of Jerusalem by the Muslim warlord Saladin in 1187. Conscious that his great-grandfather had been king of Jerusalem a half a century earlier, Richard decided to honor his commitment to leading the crusade even after he succeeded as King of England. He set off in the summer of 1190 and travelled via Sicily and then across the Mediterranean, conquering Cyprus along the way. After arriving in the Levant in 1191, he spent a year and a half there. While he did manage to stabilize the Crusaders' position and possibly prevented Saladin from conquering more of the Crusader lands, he ultimately failed in his ultimate goal of retaking Jerusalem. On his return home, he was taken prisoner in Germany and had to be ransomed to be allowed to finally return home to France. He spent the last few years of his life reconsolidating his position as King of England and ruler of the Angevin territories in France. He died from a wound that turned gangrenous while campaigning in France in 1199. Richard led a colourful life, but it was not a particularly successful reign. That Richard is so frequently described as one of medieval England's great kings is perhaps because of the contrast between him and his successor. He was succeeded after he died by his brother John, who by then was the sole surviving legitimate son of King Henry II. John's reign was disastrous for the Angevin Empire. He had revealed himself to be a duplicitous individual who regularly created problems for the English crown during Richard's absence in the Holy Land. In the midst of this, John had frequently conspired with various nobles and the French crown to try to secure the English throne for himself while Richard was absent. At the start of his reign, John engaged in a struggle with the French after King Philip II of France supported the claim of Arthur of Brittany to the English throne. Arthur was a son of John's deceased older brother, Geoffrey, and did have a stronger claim to the throne by right of primogeniture. He was only 12 years old when Richard died, though, and John had him imprisoned and presumably killed after Philip began to press Arthur's claim. While John fought off the challenge to his rule, the resulting war led to a succession of defeats, such as the capture in 1204 of Château Gaillard, a castle in Normandy that was believed to be almost impregnable. Due to this, John lost most of the territory in northern France that the House of Plantagenet had controlled, most notably the Duchy of Normandy, a dominion which had a symbolic importance for the English monarchs, as the duchy that William the Conqueror had ruled before becoming King of England. The loss of Normandy and many of the other French lands at the end of the war in 1204 left John vulnerable to criticism at home in England. He managed to silence his critics for a while by engaging in campaigns into Wales and Scotland, and over the Irish Sea to Ireland. These were relatively successful, especially the expedition to Ireland in 1210, which curbed the power of the English lords there, like Walter de Lacy, the Lord of Meath. France, though, ended up being the crux of John's reign again, at the very end of it. In 1214, he went to war with King Philip II of France again to try to reclaim Normandy. The campaign briefly went well, as John had built up a strong alliance of continental powers, such as the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV. But John quickly suffered a series of defeats thereafter. This caused severe unrest in England. The English lords were unhappy that John had both failed to reacquire Normandy, and also that he had taxed them in a heavy-handed fashion to pay for his campaign to the continent. As the unrest began to spill over into actual conflict between the lords and the crown government, John agreed to the proclamation of the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, a document issued from Runnymede in Surrey on the 15th of June 1215. It is a foundational text in English constitutional history that marks the initiation of the evolution of modern democracy, as well as political liberties. It stated that John, or any of his successors as king, had to abide by certain rules when it came to taxing the lords of the realm and respecting their rights as the nobles of England. Despite him agreeing to it, the First Barons' War broke out within weeks, as all sides reneged on their promises. Nevertheless, the Magna Carta was the foremost success of John's reign and would go on to influence many modern constitutions, including that of the United States. John died in the middle of the First Barons' War after contracting dysentery while campaigning. His death at Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire on the 19th of October 1216 meant that his son, Henry, who had only just turned 9 years of age 2.5 weeks earlier, became King Henry III of England. Clearly, a 9-year-old, even by medieval standards, could not oversee a war, and it fell to William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembroke, as Henry's protector during his minority, to prosecute the rebels and end the First Barons' War in 1217. Marshal died in 1219, and a new cohort of nobles began to rule for Henry. In a development which worried contemporaries, the 1220s went by without Henry displaying any major concern to start ruling on his own and dictating the course of events in his own kingdom. It was only after a revolt in the early 1230s by Richard Marshal, a son of the Earl of Pembroke, that Henry began to rule in his own right. But even after this, he continued to rely excessively on a select group of advisors and court favourites, establishing a tradition followed later by other rulers of the House of Plantagenet, like Edward II and Richard II, of creating divisions at court through excessive factionalism. Beyond this, Henry was known for his piety and his especially long reign. He ruled down to 1272, which, when combined with his very young age when he ascended to the throne, meant that he ruled for 56 years, a record which was only finally exceeded in England when George III ruled for 60 years between 1760 and 1820. During the long period in which Henry refused to take charge of his own realm and continued to act as though he was still a minor, The English nobles looked on and wondered when he might finally try to reclaim the French lands that his father had lost. Normandy had been such an intrinsic part of the realms of the kings of England since the days of William the Conqueror that it was viewed as essential that it be retaken and the Angevin Empire reconstituted. Henry had launched a campaign that was a complete failure in 1230, but it took until the 1250s for him to initiate a more extensive war, hoping to take advantage of the absence of King Louis IX of France on crusade in North Africa and the Levant. Henry's French adventures were almost a mirror image of what had transpired for his father 40 years earlier. He did not achieve the successes needed on the battlefield. He failed to retake Normandy or any other major French lands in the long run, and excessive taxation to pay for his armies led to unrest at home. This provoked a fresh rebellion in 1264, led by the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. To emphasize exactly how similar the causes and nature of the conflict was to the revolt John had faced 50 years earlier, it is called the Second Barons' War. It lasted for 3 years and was eventually suppressed, while Henry also issued fresh promises to respect the rights of the English lords henceforth. By the time the Second Barons' War came to an end, Henry's power, as limited as it was as king, was waning. The nobles of the realm were already looking to his son and heir, Edward, who was clearly a more competent and energetic individual than his father had ever been. Edward played an important role in suppressing the Second Barons' War. Then he began to prepare to leave England to lead the Ninth Crusade to the Holy Land. By the end of the 1260s, the Crusader states in the Levant were in a beleaguered position, and were now largely confined to coastal territories in and around the two port cities of Tripoli and Acre. Even these were threatened by a new Muslim warlord of Kipchak ethnicity from the Black Sea region, Baibars. He had become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and was a kind of spiritual successor to Saladin from the days of King Richard I. Like his great-uncle before him, Edward's crusade did not result in any kind of breakthrough against the Muslims. Edward landed at Acre on the 9th of May, 1271. He campaigned against Baibars and tried to form an alliance with the Mongols to the east. However, he quickly realized that the problems for the Christians in the Holy Land were much graver than was realized back in Europe. The Crusader lords were divided amongst themselves, and they would need a far larger army than the one Edward had brought with him to try to retake Jerusalem. In the end, Edward tried to bolster the security of Acre and Tripoli, agreed to a face-saving 10-year treaty with Baibars, and left the Levant in September 1272. The Crusader states came to an end in 1291, when Acre fell to the Mamluks of Egypt. Part of the reason why Edward was so anxious to leave the Holy Land after finalizing a treaty that he could present to the rest of Christendom as a victory of sorts was that he had received news that his father's health was deteriorating sharply. Henry III died on the 16th of November 1272, while Edward was travelling home. Having learned this en route back to England, Edward decided to slow down and conducted a diplomatic tour of Western Europe now that he was king. Edward I finally made it back to England in 1274 and was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of August 1274. The early part of his reign was dominated by the full conquest of Wales. The House of Plantagenet and the House of Normandy before it had partially controlled Wales, especially the low-lying coastal regions in the south and the borderlands in the east. But the elevated interior and parts of the north were still controlled by Welsh lords, who frequently displayed their independence through rebellions and raids. The crises in the later part of the reign of King Henry III had presented an opportunity for the Welsh lord Llywelyn ap Gruffydd to rebel against English rule and proclaim himself as Prince of Wales. In the 1270s and early 1280s, Edward undertook a lengthy campaign which achieved the most comprehensive conquest of Wales in medieval times. He cemented English control over the country by establishing English colonies and towns in key strategic locations. Barring a major rebellion in Wales in the early 15th century, the country would be tied closely to England thereafter. Similarly to the north in Scotland, Edward was determined to bring that kingdom under full English rule and become the ruler of a unified Britain, an aspiration first aimed at by King Athelstan in the 10th century, but which had never been achieved in reality by an English monarch. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy which played competing contenders for the Scottish crown off against each other, and a military campaign in 1296, Edward managed to effectively conquer Scotland. The latter campaign ended in Edward famously dragging what was believed to be the Stone of Scone, the ancient inauguration stone of the kings of Scotland, back to England with him, and imprisoning John Balliol, the King of the Scots since 1292. Despite the initial victory, Edward, whose nickname Edward Longshanks derived from his height and long legs, faced a rebellion in Scotland almost immediately. This was led by William Wallace and later by Robert the Bruce, who became King Robert I of Scotland in 1306. The long-running First Scottish War of Independence would drag on until 1328, long beyond Longshanks' time. Beyond this, Edward I's reign is known for his expulsion of England's Jewish community via the Edict of Expulsion in 1290. While Edward did launch campaigns into France and the Low Countries on multiple occasions between 1294 and 1303, he did so with the limited ambition of retaining control over the remaining English territory in western France around Gascony. This was a fresh approach. Edward was the first ruler of the House of Plantagenet who decided that it was better to try to reduce the island of Britain in its entirety to English rule than to prioritize war with the French, though it was a strategic perspective that was not continued beyond his reign. Edward I died on the 7th of July 1307 at 68 years of age. His two marriages, first to Eleanor of Castile and then to Margaret of France, had produced a huge array of royal children and pregnancies, as many as 17. However, of these, only 8 survived into their adult years, while many of these were daughters. This meant that his youngest son from his first marriage, Edward, succeeded as King Edward II. This was not a good development from the perspective of creating a stable political environment over the next 20 years. Edward II was nothing like his father. He has typically been identified as a weak and lazy king who prevaricated over many different policy issues, but his greatest failure was the way in which he promoted court favourites and their families to positions of great power at the English court. Early on, the court favourite was Piers Gaveston, who may have been Edward's lover, while later the court faction that dominated Edward's government was Hugh Despencer and his family. The way in which power, lands, titles and favours were lavished on Gaveston and the Despensers across Edward's reign alienated many of England's most powerful nobles and politicians. This was compounded by a major victory at the Battle of Bannockburn for the Scots over the English in June 1314, a year before one of the most devastating famines to hit medieval Europe swept across the continent. By the mid-1320s, an English nobleman, Roger Mortimer, had become a focus of discontent against Edward in France. Edward's wife, Queen Isabella, became his lover there, and in 1326 they invaded England and overthrew Edward II in January 1327. This meant that Edward's 14-year-old son ascended as King Edward III, albeit the real rulers of England were now Mortimer and Isabella. Edward II's fate is not 100% clear, but he was almost certainly killed in secret on Mortimer's orders at Berkeley Castle on the 21st of September 1327, where he was being held prisoner after being deposed. Roger Mortimer and Isabella held power in the late 1320s, but Edward III did not remain a child forever. On the 19th of October 1330, he attacked Mortimer and his followers at Nottingham Castle and imprisoned him. He was executed 6 weeks later, and Edward started to rule in his own right. It would in turn develop into arguably the most important reign of the entire time that the House of Plantagenet was in power, barring perhaps his grandfather Edward I. He first campaigned against the Scots in the mid-1330s and exacted revenge for the defeat at Bannockburn by defeating a Scottish army under Sir Archibald Douglas at Halidon Hill near Berwick on the 19th of July 1333. While this was an important statement of the revitalisation of English crown power in Britain, Scotland would not be reconquered by Edward III in the way that his grandfather had nearly conquered it at the end of the 13th century. Instead, Edward switched his attention to France in 1337. The direct royal line of the House of Capet had come to an end there in 1328 upon the death of Edward's uncle, King Charles IV. He was succeeded by Philip VI of the House of Valois, the head of a related branch of the Capetians. Edward had a strong claim to the throne in 1328, but he did not exercise it at that time, owing to his youth and the dominance of his government by Mortimer and his mother. That changed 12 years later. First, Edward went to war with the French in 1337 after King Philip attempted to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine. It was only in 1340 that he began pressing his claim to the French throne. These events marked the start of the 100 Years' War between the English and the French. The war which Edward III began in 1337 and which intensified in 1340 after he claimed the French throne would last for 116 years, despite being called the 100 Years' War. It was also not a constant conflict, instead going through distinct phases. The first phase lasted from 1337 to 1360. Edward III and the English were broadly successful during this. He won a number of substantial victories over the French, such as at the Battle of Crécy on the 26th of August 1346. The arrival of the bubonic plague to Europe directly after this limited Edward's ability to follow up on the advantage gained in 1346. Millions died across Western Europe as the worst of the Black Death unfolded between 1347 and 1353. The war surged again in the 1350s, leading most notably to the Battle of Poitiers on the 19th of September 1356. This was another great English victory, not only in terms of what occurred on the battlefield, but also because King John II of France was captured by the English. He remained in captivity for years, giving Edward III a strategic advantage in his negotiations with the French. This culminated in 1360 with the Treaty of Bretigny. Under the terms of it, King John was to be released on payment of 3 million écus, a huge ransom, while Edward III would be confirmed as lord of the vast majority of western and southwestern France around places like Guyenne, Gascony, Limousin, Poitou, and Agenais, as well as Calais, Ponthieu, and other lands in the north. He did not receive Normandy, the duchy that the English crown had the strongest emotional connection to, while he would also renounce his claim to the French throne. This was not quite the total victory Edward might have hoped for after the victory at Crécy 14 years earlier, but it had gone a large part of the way towards restoring England's might on the continent. It was not very long before the English and French returned to fighting each other. There was already a proxy war underway in Spain in the 1360s, where the English and French took opposing sides in the Castilian Civil War. The direct war resumed in France in 1369, the second phase of the 100 Years' War. This later stage was overseen and fought to a much greater extent by Edward III's sons. The king himself was in his late 50s, old age by 14th century standards, and he never campaigned to France directly during this second phase of the conflict. Edward had 7 sons through his marriage to Philippa of Hainault, 5 of whom reached their adult years. Of these 5, the 2 most consequential for understanding events in France in the late 1360s and into the 1370s were the eldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, and the third oldest, the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. As his father's heir and a seasoned and esteemed military commander, the Black Prince was the main commander in western France at the start of this second phase of the war. However, he had contracted dysentery while campaigning in Castile in 1367 and had to spend a growing amount of time at home in England in the 1370s. Thus, John of Gaunt rose to greater prominence as England's war leader in the 1370s, especially due to him having a claim to the throne of Castile by right of his marriage in 1371 to Constance, the daughter of the deceased King Peter of Castile. While John was active in launching campaigns like his chevauché raid across France in 1373, the war did not go well for the Plantagenets during this second phase. They suffered a catastrophic naval defeat at the Battle of La Rochelle against Castile, France's ally, in June 1372, while Gaunt's forces were decimated by a disease outbreak during his chevauché campaign the following year. High taxation at home also meant that support for the war amongst Edward III's nobles and subjects declined in England. England was shaken by two deaths in quick succession in the mid-1370s. First, the Black Prince died on the 8th of June 1376. Then, his father, King Edward III, passed away just over a year later on the 21st of June 1377. The deaths of both the king and his heir meant that the Black Prince's eldest surviving son, Richard, rose to the throne as King Richard II. He was only 10 years old at the time. Accordingly, during his minority, government affairs were managed to a large extent by his three surviving uncles. John of Gaunt was the eldest of these. The other two were Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. They performed various roles through the 1380s and into the 1390s, notably attempting to suppress the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But by the late 1380s, as Richard II entered his 20s and began to display a kind of authoritarian streak and penchant for court favourites that was reminiscent of Edward II 70 years earlier, the family began to act in different ways. John of Gaunt headed off to the continent to try to press his long-dormant claim to the throne of Castile. Conversely, Thomas of Woodstock became one of the Lords Appellant, a group of senior English aristocrats who, in 1388, collectively pressured Richard into stopping his excessive favouritism towards a small number of courtiers and allies, such as the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir Robert Tressilian. Richard was forced into accepting the demands of the Lords Appellant, but it was only a temporary truce. In the 1390s, he veered back into his old habits. When Thomas of Woodstock again began to pressure him to continue the reforms he had agreed to in 1388, Richard appears to have had Thomas murdered, though the details are murky about what occurred in 1397. Thereafter, Henry of Bolingbroke, the heir of John of Gaunt, became Richard's foremost antagonist. When John died on the 3rd of February 1399, and Richard refused to allow Henry to return to England from France to inherit the vast duchy of Lancaster and other lands, Henry launched an expedition to England. Richard was in Ireland when Bolingbroke arrived at England and was unprepared to see off this threat from his cousin. By the time he crossed back over to England, Henry had secured control over a large part of England, and Richard had to agree to abdicate, in order for his life to be spared. He only earned a reprieve for less than 5 months. In February 1400, he died in captivity. Thus did Henry of Bolingbroke become King Henry IV of England. In theory, the House of Plantagenet continued down to 1485. A dynastic line only dies out when the direct male paternal lines die out. Therefore, the accession of Henry IV in 1399, a grandson of King Edward III via John of Gaunt, constituted a continuation of the House of Plantagenet, albeit under a more junior male branch than had been the case when Richard II succeeded. This was also the case when Edward of York claimed the throne from his cousin King Henry VI in 1461 and became King Edward IV of England, as Edward was a great-grandson of King Edward III. It was only with the accession of Henry Tudor in 1485, following his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, that a truly new dynasty, the House of Tudor, emerged, as Henry was descended from King Edward III via his mother, Margaret Beaufort. This shift from a paternal to a maternal line of succession meant that a new dynasty was now in power. This being said, in practice, nearly all historians differentiate the House of Plantagenet prior to 1399 from what came afterwards. The violent overthrow of Richard II by his cousin is viewed as ushering in a distinct House of Lancaster, a name derived from John of Gaunt having acquired the Duchy of Lancaster in his youth. Similarly, when the Lancastrians were overthrown in 1461, the family which came to power are typically identified as the House of York or the Yorkists on account of their descent from the Duke of York. With their white and red roses as symbols of their houses, the Lancastrians and Yorkists were mired in the Wars of the Roses. They were sub-branches of the House of Plantagenet, but for historiographical purposes, the House of Plantagenet came to an end in 1399, giving way to nearly a century of instability of intermittent civil wars. The House of Plantagenet has a paradoxical history. On the one hand, it could be viewed as the most important royal dynasty in English history. The Magna Carta was, for instance, promulgated early on in the time of the dynasty, and is typically viewed as marking the first major milestone on the path towards England becoming a constitutional monarchy. That same document would go on to shape constitutional history around the world, as the Magna Carta had a large bearing on the creation of the American Constitution more than half a millennium later. Dozens of countries around the world today have political systems indebted to the constitutional changes that began in England under the Plantagenets. Similarly, England completed the conquest of Wales under the Plantagenets and began to stake its claim to rule over all of Britain at the same time. Ireland was partially conquered from the reign of Henry II onwards, creating a complex connection between Britain and Ireland, which continues into the 21st century. There is no denying either that there were huge low points during the long history of the Plantagenets. The Magna Carta was born out of the discontent that suffused the generally disastrous reign of King John, not least over his loss of the Angevin Empire in France. King Edward II's favouritism towards Gaveston and the Despensers created a form of factionalism within England that led to civil war and his overthrow. The 14th century also brought immense hardships in the shape of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and then the Black Death, which arrived 30 years later, that no ruler could have prevented. Despite all the twists and turns, a more effective centralized kingdom with a stronger parliament was slowly emerging over the era of the Plantagenets. The dynasty did not get everything right, but shaped England in ways that still resonate today. What do you think of the House of Plantagenet? Was this England's most successful dynasty, one that unified Wales and England under Crown rule and established the first elements of the country's constitutional system through the Magna Carta? Or did the Plantagenet rulers preside over an era of nearly constant civil wars and disorder? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.